who would like to, please?
Hi. Yes.
That's okay.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. My name's Winnie King. I'm from the University of Bristol. It's probably quite a novice question, but you mentioned the need for the role of an interventionist state. And so I wanted to, I guess, ask you a two-part question. Is one, what would be the focus of that? And two is, given the aim of regionalism, how would that work as an interventionist state on a coordinated level?
Yes.
Please.
Well, it's a big word, interventionist state, to catch the attention, so you can have a proper discussion about it. In fact, I'm a promoter of smart protectionism, because I say that protectionism is practiced nowadays in a very sophisticated way. If you go into the WTO tables about agricultural subsidies, since we are talking about agricultural we are talking about agriculture, the subsidies are gone. There is no more subsidies to agriculture according to the WTO tables that is practiced in the European Union. However, the same amount of money have been transferred to the sector, but in a very sophisticated way. It's called insurance premiums, it's called, environmental protection of landscapes, and you name it.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, that is smart protectionism. You accept the rules, you engage with those rules to make them work for you. That's smart protectionism. So you have to be very sophisticated to be able to do it. And I see a certain number of countries in Africa, not many, but enough to make the point, already practicing it, this interventionist developmental state mentality. So what they do is that they are not challengers of the rules, but they try to squeeze within the rules their specific points of interest. It's the case of Ethiopia, it's the case of Rwanda that everybody talks about, but it's also the case of Morocco.
Right.
And it's also the case of a country like Côte d'Ivoire. So we talk more about Ethiopia.
So what does Côte d'Ivoire do? Give us a specific
Like, for instance,
example.
the way they are dealing with cocoa. Number one producer in the world, they want to add value addition to their cocoa production. Right now, they are transforming about 20% of their cocoa production. And they have an objective that by 2020, it will be 50%.
Right.
And we are seeing it increasing every year. How do they do that? They go and try to convince the key players in the field, like Olam from Singapore, Nestle, and others, to try to convince them that it is in their best interest to, do a certain type of arrangements that bring capital that otherwise is very difficult for Côte d'Ivoire to mobilize. So they create the conditions of attractiveness beyond, your rankings in ease of doing business of the World Bank. So they are just going and studying the value chain in detail, and then they offer this attractiveness by making sure that the state apparatus is not going to function in a fragmented way, but rather, in a very well organized and orchestrated support system for infant industries, for new types of investment, and so on, because they have decided that those were the priorities.
So it's smart policy.
It's smart policy. That's what I said. And I think you cannot do it by having too many ambitions. You have to have 3 or 4 very well focused objectives. And, these countries are growing very fast.
Isn't Côte d'Ivoire the fastest growing country in the world, I think? 10.something%.
Well, 9 most likely,
Okay.
but one of the 10 fastest growing.
Another question here. And then.
Thanks, Stephen Gilb. I work here at the ODI. So just following up on the previous question and your response, what makes what Côte d'Ivoire is doing, for example, or for that matter Rwanda or Ethiopia, different from a kind of relatively simple and conventional investment promotion, trying to attract Nestle or Olam or one of these chocolate makers to put up a processing plant? how does that lead to sort of industrial diversification, true structural transformation in the sense of building manufacturing industry? And I think more importantly, and this is, I think, where the key to the East Asia model is, building a domestic business class which is able to actually establish firms in different industries and build them into competitive entities for the domestic and for the export markets. So, you know, what is smart about that? I'd like to hear your take on that. And secondly, if I can just add to this.
Well, can we just take that one?
Well, just elaborating on it, I think what's important is also that when African countries have tried to do smart industrial policy, a big problem, and this goes to an article that you wrote, David, last week in the FT, I think, or maybe last week, about the issues around governance. Because it seems to me that African states are not very strong.
The empty chair.
The empty chair.
The empty chair, yeah. African states are not strong. They're actually quite weak. The states that have carried out industrial policy successfully have been strong, not in the sense of being authoritarian, although that may have been part of it, but in the sense of having the political capability to direct subsidies and support in the way that they chose to, and to stop doing that. So how is the state in Africa going to become effective in that sense?
Well, I mean, it requires an elaborate answer that I would have been very pleased to provide. But let me just do 2 or 3 contributions around it. The first one is to say that it is not true that countries in Africa have a state that is weaker than what Asia had when they did their industrial revolution. Maybe with the exception of China.
I would disagree with that, but anyway.
Well, you know, it takes us in a different route, but you know, it's something that I really like, is to compare Asia with Africa and dispel some of the misperceptions that exist about Africa, you know, like number of conflicts in Africa. Yes, Africa has a lot of conflicts. There are many more in Asia than in Africa. Number of people affected in conflicts, many more in Asia than Africa. Number of people displaced by conflict, many more in Asia than Africa. Number of pirates, many more in Asia than Africa. I can go on, you know, but normally, you know, people have this perception that is based on a very well-established sort of narrative about the continent that tries to minimize some of the positive aspects. But I don't want here to do Africa propaganda, you know, piece, and rather respond to your very interesting comment. I would say that, you know, take the example of the 4 countries I mentioned, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Cote d'Ivoire, and Morocco. In each one of them, I can explain to you in a certain degree of detail, if we had the time, why the states are strong and why they are capable of actually implementing industrial policy. And each one of the 4 cases is because of institutional capabilities that are not immediately visible. Ethiopia is because of the military. You know, most of the industrial developments that are taking place in the country are related to the capabilities of the military, and the military intervening to sort of resolve the red tape difficulties that the partners may have. Because if you have, you know, a normal business in Ethiopia, you go through an incredible red tape. You know, in the ease of doing business index, they are one of the worst performers. Why is it that they attract so much
but if you have a
FDI?
gun, it's easier,
FDI. But of course, you know, if you are going to build, you know, your factories with, you know, participation of the military, and the military is going to resolve most of the difficulties that you have, then, you know, you have a deal, and you are predictable on top of it. And of course, the investors like predictability. In the case of Rwanda, is because, you know, the skills composition of the labor force for the type of objectives in the industrial policy that they have established does exist. And again, people see the political system, you may like or not Mr. Kagame, as extremely predictable. So again, you know, you have a factor that makes this attractive. We don't need to talk about the predictability of Morocco and the king. because he's the number one investor in his own country. And of course, you have in Côte d'Ivoire, one of the most diversified economies in West Africa. And the growth of Côte d'Ivoire is basically because the basic infrastructure for the type of economy that they have already existed. It was dilapidated during the war, but it can be reestablished very quickly. And that makes it extremely attractive. Now, I would take your point if we are talking about Nigeria. It's much more difficult than to deal with how we are going to make industrial policy in Nigeria is a big challenge. And probably one that will make the big difference in Africa. And I didn't respond to one part of your question, which was the regional dimension. If we are going to create a continental free trade area, which is a discussion we are having right now, how are we going to make that fast enough and effective enough to allow for this type of attractiveness to be also in the equation?
And just briefly to add to this, and then I'll take the next question, but just Kenya as a counterexample. I mean, Kenya is thought to be doing very well. Maybe that's a mirage, but it's been growing fast, it's dynamic, it's innovative,
yes.
and yet it's kind of almost the classic laissez-faire, let's see what happens.
Would you say that Bangladesh is doing very well?
Kind of. I mean, yes.
Well, if your answer is kind of, I would say Kenya is doing very well, kind of.
Yeah.
I mean, it's things happen, but it's not as a result of consistent policies and a certain architecture behind, but because certain capabilities do exist. And then, that makes things happen.
Yeah.
It's the case of Bangladesh.
Well, a march of senses Bangladesh does better than Kenya.
Yes.
Than India, I'm sorry.
Yes,
with less
in
money.
that sense, Kenya will be in the same category.
There was another question there. I think just speak and it'll work.
Richard Murray from the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. No, Deputy Chair. I was going to ask, with a view to picking up what you said about private investment in... What you said about the failure of private investment in agriculture because it hasn't been considered an economic problem and treated as such. Whether you feel Africa has enough ownership of its human development in terms of education and the skills mix, some of its health systems, and particularly with a view to the demographic elements that are going to change over the next period as you see a continent that gets a lot older.
Yeah.
And can I throw in one other thing? Does it have enough ownership of its land? I mean, land seems to be a crucial question for agriculture.
Well, on the skills, we have about 3 years less of education than the likes of Bangladesh and other big manufacturing producers in Asia of, let's say, the second tier. What we don't have is the skills mix that is required for more sophisticated type of industrial production. So that's the reason why, if we are going to industrialize in Africa right now with the current, landscape, we have to target low-end value manufacturing and not, being aggressively trying to reach where we really don't possess the skills. But this is right now. If we look into the future, then the problem that you have posed is gigantic. If we don't do something about it, it's going to be really problematic. We need a complete skills revolution in the continent to be able to really cope with the type of projects and aspirations that are being discussed right now. And I think that is something that really, I'm afraid to say, most governments have not really invested enough time and devoted really attention to, with a few exceptions. And I think it's very sad. Land. Contrary to perceptions, because there's a lot of discussions about land grabbing in Africa. When you look into comparators between Africa and other regions, developing regions, you discover that the foreign ownership of land in Africa is much lower than it is in Asia and than it is in Latin America. But there is sort of this clarion call for Africa to be protected and be different and so on. Africa needs modernizing its agriculture, and that should include foreign ownership. The problem is how you do it. The big problem right now that we have to address is land tenure systems are not consistent, they are fragmented, they are politically manipulated, and they are not an enabler
Yeah.
for agricultural productivity. They constitute right now a big issue to be resolved. And that is much more important than, say, foreign ownership per se.
Yeah, I wasn't talking about foreign ownership so much. I was talking about people who
Yeah.
are working on their own land that they've maybe lived on for generations. But do they feel that that is their land? I mean, are they prepared to invest?
It's a mess.
Yeah.
It is a mess. And until this is solved, it's one of the ingredients for agricultural transformation in Africa. Until it is solved, we are going to have difficulties really attracting the kind of investments that are required.
Right. Another question, please.
My name is Antoinette Salah. I'm an agricultural consultant, and thank you for your conversation. I'm really glad to hear that agricultural productivity, agricultural potential is at the forefront of many African countries and governments. Agriculture has a potential in Africa, and there's no doubt about it, we know it. Irrigation also, we haven't discussed about irrigation potential, where only 5% of the land is being irrigated. My question is about the youth. What can you tell us about the youth and women and African entrepreneurs who want to get involved into the agribusiness and really transform the agricultural chain value, the agricultural businesses, and transform the agricultural land in Africa?
And we've got about 3 minutes, so that's 1 minute on youth, 1 minute on entrepreneurs, and 1 minute on women.
I'll pick the youth because, I always say that a lot of governments right now in Africa are busy talking about promotion of youth policies. And, they consistently want to appear as politically correct by having youth policies in general. And it makes me laugh because, the youth are the majority of the population. We need some special programs for those who are sort of minorities. The youth is just, if you have consistent policy in any area, you are already including the youth if you do it properly, because it's, 70% of the population. And this is a consistent mistake that is done in a number of policy interventions, including on agriculture.
There's a couple of questions here which I should have asked you before, so just very quickly, and I'm sorry about this. So we have a question saying we still refer to Africa as a single block, but there are actually many different blocks. Can you see a kind of specialization emerging in Africa where different blocks or different countries do different things?
Well, the whole discussion about continental free trade area in the continent is about, making that possible, to have champions that are not just particular enterprises, but also champions that are countries specialized in advantages that they may have, either because of their location, or because of their natural resources, or because of their skills mix, and you name it. But at the time where Europe is debating Brexit, we have to revisit all of that.
Yeah. There's another question here about heritage preservation and sustainable tourism. Is this a viable industry? Is this something that can create enough jobs?
It's actually a very good job promoter. This sector. It has emerged right now as the fourth largest in terms of FDI. After other areas, in picking order, you have first the mobile and technology sector. Then the second is the financial services. The third is consumer and retail, and then the fourth is now tourism, construction, and real estate. It is a boom because all of those are linked to services, are linked to internal consumption, partly. The middle class rising, that is the real propeller of growth in the continent. Now, there is a second aspect to the question, which is about sustainability,
Yeah.
which is a debate that is not sufficiently grasped in Africa right now. So you have some manifestations of interest, like, burning, ivory, or very sort of dramatic
Gestures.
gestures, but there is no real consistent discussion about integrating sustainability dimensions in some of the policies
Right.
that are being implemented.
Right. I think we're going to have to leave it there. I think it was a fascinating discussion, and one of the most positive discussions I've had about Africa in the 6 months that I've been studying. I mean, there's a lot there. I think if you strip out the three big economies, Africa's growing faster. There's a certain kind of determination to do things about power and about agriculture. We may not yet be seeing the results, but you certainly detect a sort of a change of attitude. And, to some extent there seems to be a plan, which is something that we certainly are lacking in Britain at the moment. So, I come away from that conversation, a little bit more optimistic than I have been, and I've been sort of, I've come with a sort of a cynic's eye to this beat, but I've, I come away with some food for thought.
I'm glad.
And some more positive outlook. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
And for going through these issues.
And always remember, because you are a fan of Asia, always remember that the number of pirates in the Strait of Malacca is 3 times more than all the pirates in Africa.
Is that right? Okay.